Hello there. I don't know what is going on with my camera. Yeah. You know when your cat just has complete free reign of everything that you own? Yeah, this is this is what happens. Everything you own just gets completely either broken or moved around to the point that you don't know where anything is anymore. And the things that you had set up in a very particular order or in a very specific way gets really fucked up. Unfortunately, oh yeah, we actually finished this book. You don't have a cat to serve. You are lucky. Yeah, but they are so cute, Chris. It's good to see you all. Welcome, welcome. Hopefully, everything on Twitch and YouTube is working now, and looks fairly okay. Because, cats don't give a shit about your stuff. And hello on Discord. I don't think anybody is here on Discord. So, before we begin, I want to find my notes on this book. So, we are starting a book today called Abolition, Feminism Now. And it is by Angela Y. Davis, Gina Dent, Erica Mayners, and Beth E. Richie. It is not just by Angela Davis. This is a discussion on specifically abolitionism within a feminist lens. So, who here knows what abolition actually is about? Does anybody know what abolition is about? Hi. Well, getting rid of a system. But in this context, abolition is about the prison system. And looking at the abolition of the prison system through a feminist lens. Abolition shapes our political moment. It halts the construction of new prisons, propelling movements to divest from policing and privatized punitive justice. What has been erased from the abolitionist narrative is the central history of feminist organizing, usually queer, anti capitalist, and grassroots among women of color in particular, who continue to cultivate abolition as a movement. Abolition is our best response to endemic forms of state and interpersonal gender and sexual violence because it is rooted in the domination of an entire populace. The reason that the for profit prison system exists is because slavery ended and women of color were no longer permitted to be breeding factories for more slaves and free labor and bodies to experiment on. And this is true for black bodies in general, that it was no longer permissible for black bodies to be exploited. So, how were they going to do that? Unequal and racist policing and the for-profit prison system, which profits off of labor. Sorry, I'm having to adjust this bra. My apologies. So, Abolition, Feminism Now is one of the few books that I am reading here that I haven't read before. And you get to see me opening my new copy, which I got from, I don't know if any of you have ever encountered or met a creator on here by the name of Erica Foreman. Erica is one of the most beautiful people I have ever met. She's a writer. She is an editor at, I think a commissioning editor at Haymarket Books. And her vibe is best explained as ethereal, but very grounded in reality, in the realities of the things that she fights for. And if you want to read some of her work, please look up Erica Foreman. She has an anthology of poetry called Salt Body Shimmer. Please do yourself a favor and read it. It's a very, very good read. So today we start Abolition, Feminism Now. I've got it on the back here as by Angela Y. Davis and others. Because, yeah, it's a lot. There are a lot of people to put here. So, let us begin with the preface. In 2001, a cluster of people attached to two emerging organizations connected to burgeoning movements gathered in a stuffy room over a weekend to hash out more than a statement. A key instigator for the small convening, primarily of women of color, was a pressing question: how to continue to knit together campaigns and analyses focused on both building a world without prisons and policing and building a world free of gender and sexual violence. In sight, Women of Color Against Violence was a growing network challenging the mainstream/white stream anti-violence movement's reliance on policing and punishment, and critical resistance had recently coalesced into an organization of abolitionists campaigning for the end of policing and prisons. To understand how colonial domination works, one only has to look to the prison system. The prison system is punitive, it is not restorative, and it abuses people's bodies. And a system that abuses people's bodies can never be a place that deters or rehabilitates people inside those spaces for abusing people's bodies. Ooh, you have a flash goal. While both were new and developing networks with many overlapping people and shared analyses, These two groups recognize the value of articulating a collective vision and the importance of writing and circulating a statement on the difficult intersection of their shared work. Thank you. They understood that crafting a joint statement that balanced an attention to both interpersonal and state violence represented not only an engagement with the thorniest subjects for both organizations, but also an opportunity for public engagement in the production of shared analytics, campaign demands, and radical visions. Members of the newly formed groups spent an intense weekend at Mills College in Oakland, California, hammering out the Incite Critical Resistance Statement on Gender Violence and the Prison Industrial Complex, which clearly named the vision and the challenge. The statement reads in part, "It is critical that we develop response to gender violence that does not depend on a racist, sexist, classist, and homophobic criminal justice system. It is also important that we develop strategies that challenge the criminal justice system that also provide safety for survivors of sexual and domestic violence." One of the first things we hear when we say ACAB, abolish prisons, abolish the police, is what will we do with the rapists? My response to that is they don't go to prison anyway. Instead, they become presidents. Outlining how radical freedom, mutual accountability, and passionate reciprocity can build toward the survival and care of all peoples, this 11-point statement identified at its core precisely why abolition must be feminist and why feminism must be abolitionist. Turn them into wall art? Yeah, I quite like that. Great paintings. Jackson Pollock will be proud. Like most collaborative political work, the Incite Critical Resistance Statement arrived in 2001, long past its due date, and initially landed quietly. Originally published both as a poster and manifesto, the statement circulated in feminist and abolitionist movement spaces, propelled by the clarity and compelling nature of its demands, as well as the growing cadre of organizers with whom the statement resonated. As a key reference point in the history of abolition feminism, the document is heralded as an exemplary and clarion call for a more complex approach to anti-police and anti-prison movements, as well as an insistence on anti-racism and anti-capitalism as central dimensions of contemporary feminism. In 2021, we return to the statement and its interventions at a critical moment for the future of social justice, as contemporary organizing makes abolition increasingly irresistible. I like the fact that they call it irresistible. Both as a mode of analysis and a political practice. Inching from the margins toward the mainstream, from the end of course syllabi to the beginning, calls for abolition proliferate. Guardian headlines announce unprecedented support for defunding the police. Teen Vogue publishes multiple articles, all identifiable with the tag abolition, on topics ranging from how police do not make us safer to why hate crime laws will not end anti-Asian violence. Crowds in the street chant abolition. The proliferation of abolitionist lawyering has been spurred on, in part, by the National Lawyers Guild's resolution endorsing abolition in 2015 by formerly incarcerated people's opening law office in Pittsburgh's Abolitionist Law Center, and in webinars and organizing sponsored by groups such as Law for Black Lives. School boards from Oakland to Minneapolis are voting to cancel contracts with police departments. Colleges and universities are questioning the role of campus police and reconsidering, bless you, contractual relationships with local law enforcement. And this is important because sanctions and boycotts work. Divesting works. And this is coming from a South African. It works. When people in the West say that sanctions only hurt the person in the street, they are not taking into consideration that they are the ones that actually they're the ones who benefit the from the trade, because they're getting all of the public service. It's not just the country and the oligarchs. Boycotting helps entire movements. Habibti, there's only 5 people here. He's downstairs. Sorry, I had to wash my hair today. The cats left, and one of them like climbed onto my head and actually like attacked me, because I was putting her into the enclosure and she didn't want to go in. But yeah, ending relationships with law enforcement is a powerful move. Yeah, she just didn't want to go into the little carrier. But now I have scratches all over me. She bit my finger. I don't know if you can see. As abolition becomes more influential as a goal, its collective feminist lineages are increasingly less visible, even during moments made possible precisely because of feminist organizing, especially of young queer people of color whose pivotal labor and analysis is so often erased. This is important. The screamy one, yes. The screamy one. God, she can scream like... It's so painful. I injured my shoulder last week and my knees are aching like crazy. Still not as painful as this little fucker's tooth into my finger. Erasing somebody's labor in a movement is common practice. And it has been done to people of color throughout history. Every single movement has had its invisible people. Women and people of color. Queer organizers. I mean, if it wasn't for a black trans woman, pride would not be a thing. But there are still people, queer people, who erase people of color and trans identity from the movement. Like, I have literally met queer people who say LGB without the T and then dress up for pride. I'm like, what are you doing? As some recognized 20 years ago, abolition is most effectively advanced by naming and elevating an analysis and practice that is collective and feminist. We return to the profound intervention of the Incite Critical Resistance statement. Abolition is unimaginable without radical anti-capitalist, anti-racist, decolonial queer feminism. Thank you so much. The small book argues that abolitionist traditions have relied on feminist analysis and organizing from their inception, and the versions of feminism we embrace are also not possible without an abolitionist imagination. Bridging the overlap, but sometimes discontinuous world of scholars and organizers, we we explore recent movements and organizational formations, including those anchored by Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, and Critical Resistance, revealing an ecosystem of abolition feminism that is often relegated to the background. As freedom is a constant struggle, abolition feminism has always been politics. The refusal to co-sign humans and other beings to disposability, inseparable from practice. And the fact that the most marginalized are relegated to the background is not just deplorable. It is depressing how often we can say throughout history, hi Moss, how often we can say throughout history that this has happened before. It's not new. It's something that is so ordinary that women of color in organizing spaces sometimes get so shut down by people who are supposed to be our comrades that we're just like, whatever, it happens. I'll put it in the minutes. So maybe someone will read them. We look to the interventions offered by earlier feminist organizers. The Combahee River Collective Statement of 1977, for example, was one of several key political treatises that established a political path for radical feminist organizing that functioned, like all manifestos and open statements, as both a declaration and process. While for many, the River Collective Statement is a historical document establishing contemporary black, lesbian, queer, anti-capitalist feminism, the organizing that shaped its creation was as central to the content of the statement. Centering the lives of black women and other women of color, their collective organizing generated a sense of urgency for the kind of truth-telling in which on-the-ground feminist campaigns for liberation engaged deeply with larger, overarching political principles and debates. If you are not including women of color in your organization, or if women of color are avoiding your organization, especially black women, you need to ask yourself, is this movement racist? Is it sexist? Because men of color will accept white supremacy when it benefits them, because it also comes with patriarchy. So, yeah, if your organization doesn't have women of color, you got a problem. You got a huge, huge problem. And I like that they bring up truth-telling. Truth-telling as resistance has always been the MO of women and femmes of color, because it is where truth is shared in spaces where truth is safe and sacred, that we get to the root of the problems. Because once we hear people's truths, we also hear what needs to be done, what needs to be addressed. This broad, optimistic, action-oriented, complex sense of abolition feminism and its theory of change reverberates in efforts of organizations that actively work to free people, like the Brisbane, Australia-based Sisters Inside and the UK Sisters Uncut, and across contemporary statements, open letters, posters, and manifestos from networks like the Crunk Feminist Collective, the Movement for Black Lives, the Statement of Solidarity with Palestine from the Abolition and Disability Justice Coalition, and of course, Insight and Critical Resistance. We framed this book as a critical genealogy rather than a manifesto, one that emphasizes how important it is to trace political lineages. We offer a set of ideas in thick descriptions of unfinished practices rather than promoting rigid definitions, attempting to reveal the common constructive threads of the work and the promise of abolition feminism rather than constrain it to a sectarian political position. You can't constrain it to a political position. It's not a political position. It is a lived reality that needs to be enacted into practice. From storefronts in Chicago and prisons in Manchester to Sao Paulo streets and Johannesburg classrooms, our work proceeds genealogically to address subjugated histories of organizing, that it must inform and strengthen our present mobilizations. We use the term ecosystem to avoid prescriptive or reifying frameworks and to amplify dynamic ecologies of political work, highlighting legacies, analytics, and questions that are often erased and obscured. We also use the term ecosystem to mark the complexity of a landscape populated with intertwined networks, campaigns, mobilizations, and organizations. Narrating a history of the present ecosystem, attending to subjugated knowledges and erasures, not only gestures to the underlying strata of necessary collaborative labor, but also provides key imaginative and conceptual tools to engage with in our contemporary movements. As our thinking and practices continue to be stretched and challenged by learning, teaching, and analyzing collective struggle, we do not offer this collaborative project as a thoroughing linear historical account of every organizational or conceptual treatment of abolition feminism. Instead, Abolition Feminism Now puts abolition feminism as a concept into conversation with both the historical and contemporary ideological and political praxis that demands explicit and expansive ideas about how to go about freedom making. And making freedom, creating, it really is about creating an ecosystem in which freedom is enabled through the work that we do, through the organizing that we do, through the mobilizations that we do. Tomorrow afternoon, what we're doing is we're going to the, we're marching outside the U.S. Embassy. I'm not allowed within 100 meters of the U.S. Embassy, so I'm going to be like breaking the law. We are protesting outside the U.S. Embassy to release Maduro and his wife. Because we need to create mobilizations. We need to create spaces where mobilizations happen, where mobilizations work, where people are not scared of their government. Governments should be afraid of its people. As critical genealogy, we start with the recognition that these overlapping histories of abolitionist and feminist movements are deeply intertwined, but they do not unfold alongside each other in neat chronological order. Historian Elsa Barkley Brown describes history as everybody talking all at once, multiple rhythms being played simultaneously, and reminds us that linear history will lead us to linear politics, and neither will serve well in an asymmetrical world. We welcome other renditions of abolition feminism, and we contend that genealogy should always be questioned, because there's always an unacknowledged reason for beginning at a certain moment in history as opposed to another, and it always matters which narratives of the present are marginalized or expunged. As we were talking about yesterday when reading Orientalism, in creation of a history for people outside of the West, they created a lie. So we need to actually go back and delineify that history and say, okay, where's the lie? What do we need to dismantle? What do we need to take apart so that truth can exist? Rather than read the short book and snapshots of campaigns, organizational formulations, and analyses, we offer as a roadmap, a prescriptive tool for the present and future, or as an authoritative voice on organizations or movements. We suggest an engagement with the goal of our collective writing instead, to expand dialogue, practice, reflection, and more. So nobody has the truth. There's only one universal truth, is that all who live will die. That is the only truth we have. And the only constant in human history is change is inevitable, regardless where that change leads us. Change is absolutely inevitable. Any questions so far? Because that is the preface. And that cats rule us. I mean, a lot of people don't like them. And I think it's for that reason, that they can't control them. Just a note. If you are a person who dates men and said man does not like cats, run. Run away. It's different if the man is allergic. I mean, that's one thing. But if man does not like cat, man probably does not understand consent, because cats are a lesson in consent. Please, Saintless, if you were here earlier when I explained how I was pierced by murder mittens. Yeah, just mentioning the fucking knives for hands. Yeah, I was attacked by murder mittens today. Really badly. Like I was bleeding. But yes. Cats are a lesson in consent. It's okay. Thank you. So we get to the introduction. Why abolition feminism? As abolition haltingly moves into public discourse, and as some of its proponents underscore the feminist dimension of abolition as well as the abolitionist dimension of feminism, a clear articulation of the term abolition feminism becomes a critical challenge. Concepts derived both from organizing and scholarship can become brittle, empty terms, tools to wield against others rather than living, generative, and rigorous frameworks that deepen and strengthen our theoretical understanding and our movements for social and political transformation. We begin to collaborate on this book. When we began, to collaborate on this book, we assumed that identifying what was and is feminist or abolitionist would be relatively simple. I don't understand what you mean. Yet, this emerged as a more complex question, partially due to the medium. It can be challenging to write about organizing and ideas that are by nature in motion and therefore always nuance in relationality. Neither abolition nor feminism are static identifiers, but rather political methods and practices. It is practice. You practice feminism. You practice the mobilization of abolitionist networks. These are living, breathing terms that are constantly undergoing revision, because that is what current movements need to do. Movements need to undergo transformations and revisions every single time our lived realities change. Is a project or campaign feminist or abolitionist if participants do not use these words to describe their labor or campaign? Could we discreetly mark what was feminist? About abolition or abolitionist about feminism? How does abolition feminism take up a political question or these questions that are germane but often obscured in the rendering of both concepts, considering radical capitalism, heteropatriarchy, internationalism, and transphobia as examples? Because these and other questions continue to play generative roles without demanding reductionist responses, we punctuate each word in the title with a full stop to signify that each of these concepts, with their own singular histories, frames this project. As abolition and feminism continue to be theorized discreetly by a range of scholars and organizers, our project is not to erase, correct, or supplant these pre-existing and ongoing efforts. Rather, the very meaning of the term abolition feminism incorporates a dialectic, a relationality, and a form of interruption, an insistence that abolitionist theories and practices are most compelling when they are also feminist. And conversely, a feminism that is also abolitionist is the most inclusive and persuasive version of feminism for these times. And of course, when we look back on all theories, we say that's no longer true, or that's no longer applicable. Unfortunately, when we look at theories of race and gender, we can't really say much of it is outdated or not applicable because, thank you, Kiara, because we have the same issues. A lot of the truths that people like Frederick Douglass and W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about in the 1800s and the early 1900s are still applicable today. Frantz Fanon, who was writing in the 50s, his work is still applicable today. That is why everything is relational. But it's always undergoing revision. Fanon insisted that his work constantly be interrogated and critiqued. His insistence on that was quite loud. That when new truths begin to surface, when people's voices that have been silenced start to speak, include their voices in these kinds of theories, because these theories are not static. These movements are not static. That's why it's called a movement. Rather, the very meaning of the term abolition feminism incorporates a dialectic. While these approaches are always analytically and experientially overlapping, the movement to end gender and sexual violence, for example, can never be isolated from the work to end state violence, including the violence of policing. This more holistic understanding cannot always be assumed. As critical race theorist Mari Matsuda wrote in 1991, a feminism that is able to meaningfully challenge emergent and existing forms of domination must always be flexible enough to ask the other question. The why I try to understand the interconnection of all forms of subordination is through a method I call ask the other question. Exactly. This is something, this is exactly what I was saying on Deadpan's Live this morning. Is that we really need to interrogate all of the questions that are, that even the silliest questions, the seemingly silliest questions that pop into our minds when we are interrogating the why, where, how, when, what, who of political and cultural colonial domination. So we always have to follow the paper trail, we always have to follow the money, but we also need to ask the other question. DM. When I see something that looks racist, I ask, where's the patriarchy in this? When I see something that looks sexist, I ask, where's the heterosexism in this? When I see something that looks homophobic, I ask, where is the class interest in this? And every single thing that we interrogate must be looked at through an intersectional lens. And no more you commenting. Working in coalition forces us to look for both the obvious and non-obvious relationships of domination. And, as we have done this, we have come to see that no form of subordination ever stands alone. I need to actually go back and see if I can put that piece together. I recently published on my Patreon a series called The Trifecta of Oppression: Settler Colonialism and Capitalism, Patriarchy, and White Supremacy. And when I said the white supremacist delusion in a conversation this morning, yes, absolutely, the hierarchy, intersections of oppression systems working in alignment with each other. They don't just work in alignment, though. That's why I call it a trifecta. The unholy trifecta of oppression. It's not just that they work in alignment with each other, they work with and for each other. Matsuda's invocation requires an acknowledgement of intersectionality, the intersectionality of struggles, that also represents our willingness to anticipate change and build into organizing a critical generative reflexivity and opportunity to learn and grow. For us, abolition feminism is political work that embraces this both and perspective, moving beyond binary either or logic and the shallowest forms of reform. And that's why I always say, a thing can be more than one thing. We recognize the relationality of state and individual violence, and thus frame our resistance accordingly, supporting survivors and holding perpetrators accountable, working locally and internationally, building communities while responding to immediate needs. We work alongside people who are incarcerated while we demand their release. We mobilize in outrage against the rape of another woman and reject increased policing as a response. We support and build sustainable and long-term cultural and political shifts to end ableism and transphobia while proliferating different in-the-moment responses when harm does happen. Some messy and risky, These collective practices of creativity and reflection shape new visions of safety, animating complex landscapes that shape abolition feminism. Hi. An ability to look both inward and outward, to meet both in immediate demands and confront broad systems of injustice, and to think in complicated and layered ways about abolition represents a feminist approach to change. Our approach builds on notions of double and triple jeopardy put forth by Fran Beale and the Third World Women's Alliance, along with Deborah King's theory of multiple jeopardy, or the idea that forms of domination and oppression both interrelate and compound, what Kimberly Crenshaw would later define as intersectionality in the legal context. These ideas have important lineages, often stretching back to the 19th century. Abolition feminism is a praxis, a politically informed practice that demands intentional movement and insightful responses to the violence of systemic oppression. Building on these foundational approaches, this theory of change proclaims that we can and must do multiple things at the same time. What have I been saying for years? For years. That everybody has a role to play, and we need to be tackling oppression and domination, colonialism and subjugation from every front, and each person has their role to play. Sometimes it's about making the soup for the protesters. We work locally and internationally. We hold people accountable and believe that people and things can change. We believe in being radical and active. We reflect, learn, and adjust our practices. We react to injustice. We build different ways of living. We are clear that organizing to end gender violence must include work against the prison industrial complex, against border patrols, the incarceration of disability, against the criminalization of radical democratic protest, and as centrally for mutual aid, cop-free schools, reproductive justice, dignity for trans lives. All this is possible because the we is not a set of individuals, but rather a collective that grounds and defines its members, and the projects, goals, and campaigns that are connected to the everyday, thus encompassing joy and struggle inextricably. This book is speaking my soul. Abolition feminism does not shy away from contradictions, which are often the spark for change. Holding on to this both and, we can and do support our collective, immediate, and everyday needs for safety, support, and resources, while simultaneously working to dismantle carceral systems. Unhoused people should be afforded a safe place to sleep while we organize campaigns to build housing for all. Immediate and long term. The immediate is sometimes at the drop of a hat, getting a call at 3 o'clock in the morning saying, hey, somebody is coming to your house right now because she's just escaped an abusive situation and she needs a meal and a bed. But it also looks like fighting for safe houses to be more inclusive. Fighting for more government funding going into shelters. For shelters to not be a place that re-traumatizes and re-victimizes victims. It's not either or. It's yes and. Campaigns to close jails and prisons can move forward as we continue to teach classes inside prisons and as we support restorative justice processes and organizing around parole hearings. Protests continue against sexual assault and murder committed by police officers while we build international solidarity movements against the exportation of militarized police tactics. Israel. Discovering and in fact embracing this ambiguous terrain located in the space between necessary responses to immediate needs and collective and radical demands for structural and ultimately revolutionary change is a hallmark of abolition feminism, rather than being limitations, prescriptive horizons, or opportunities for empty quick fixes that resolve little. These contradictions are generative and necessary sites for collective analysis and thus labor. The negotiation of this terrain also continues to create experimental and collective practices of safety, accountability, and healing, untethered from the existing criminal justice system, or legal system, Often named formally as community accountability or transformative justice, these tools and practices, with accompanying analysis, provide and proliferate responses without engaging the carceral or punitive state. Engagement is both reactive, what we do in the moment when harm and violence happens, and also provides examples of ideas for wider, longer-term preventative frameworks, or how to stop harm from happening. Because we are always going to be reactive to harm. We are always going to be reactive to crime. We are always going to be reactive to all of these situations until the root of it is removed. You can't keep chopping off limbs off a tree in hopes that it'll fix the rotten root. These practices of community accountability and transformative justice emanate from our political frameworks and offer multiple concrete ways for more people to become involved. The growing and internationalist abolition feminist ecosystem, sustained overwhelmingly by unpaid labor, continues to produce radical tools and other resources. Before dissolving in January 2020, Berlin's Transformative Justice Collective spent years documenting the multiple ways ordinary people try to respond to interpersonal harm, particularly gender and sexual violence, without resorting to police and prisons, offering workshops and resources to share tactics and strategies. With reading and learning circles, discussion groups, and other workshops, Alternative Justice India works to offer community-based anti-carceral and feminist interventions to sexual harm and abuse in India. You cannot look at India's legal criminal system as being in any way, shape, or form for victims. The Nirbhaya case was concluded so quickly. The interviews with the rapists in the Nirbhaya case show exactly why you cannot turn to the police system. Because it's the attitudes that allow for these things to happen. It's the system itself that allows for these things to happen. But on the flip side, on the flip side, the Hathras case, where a woman was raped and burned alive, was not even prosecuted because the woman was Dalit and untouchable in caste terms. through direct action, statements, and political education events, the UK's Sisters Uncut network concretely identifies and demands how budgetary resources can be removed from carceral forms and reinvested inside communities, in healthcare, education, and the arts. Survived and Punished and Love and Protect support survivors who are criminalized for self-defense by developing campaigns that advocate for individuals, and they simultaneously make visible structural and systemic forms of state violence, make visible structural and systemic forms of state violence. Queer and trans networks, from the UK's Bent Bars group to the Bay Area's transgender, gender variant, and intersex justice projects, build and disseminate ways to guarantee safety, while calling the police is not an option, and when some are locked up in institutions predicated on violence. Among this rich ecology of resources, how-to texts about practicing transformative justice and community accountability circulate and ignite discussion and practice and spur further invention. People Against Prisons Aotearoa offers pamphlets to accompany their workshop, including transformative justice workshops, practical ways of solving interpersonal harm and conflict in our communities, which provide tools to address everyday forms of conflict without engaging law enforcement. Fumbling Toward Repair by Miriam Kaba and Shira Hassan is a workbook for community accountability facilitators. Edgeris Dixon and Leah Lakshmi Pipenza Samarishna's Beyond Survival, Strategies and Stories from the Transformative Justice Movement, and the edited collection by Ching In Chen and comrades entitled The Revolution Starts at Home, Confronting Intimate Violence within Activist Communities, are all full stories reflecting on and analyzing how people are experimenting, sometimes unsuccessfully, with addressing conflict and harm within organizing communities. The 576-page toolkit by Creative Interventions and the Storytelling and Organizing Project in Oakland offer tools, language, and wealth of material to begin to study and then to practice. Not a checklist or one-stop fix, this expanding constellation of resources and organizations, one piece of our internationalist abolition feminist ecosystem, offers multiple tangible tools for people to practice together, now. These resources, and too many others, are shared, critiqued, translated, and modified at grassroots convenings and gatherings across the globe, almost all organized by uncompensated labor. Alongside these textual resources, artists continue to produce visual interventions in our carceral state, including works that meticulously document the realities of day-to-day survival inside prison. Artists have always been key agents in seeding resistance and providing the tools for us to imagine otherwise. When people say, what is this piece of art doing? It's moving people. It's speaking to people in a language beyond words. Exemplified by the visuals incorporated throughout this book, posters, memes, banners, statements, slogans, on Signal, Snapchat groups, and more, also create, to tweak a phrase from the visual art scholar Nicole Fleetwood, anti-carceral aesthetics, or as we would frame it, an abolitionist feminist aesthetic. To grow our collective capacities to visualize the regime of heterogendered and racialized punishment that is the US prison/police state, and also the myriad ways that people, poor, queer, First Nations, brown, black, and or non-citizens, attempt to flourish and resist in spite of all of these obstacles. Over the past decade, the audience has also exploded for the work of writers who center speculative black, female, and queer futures, such as Olivia Butler, N.K. Jemisin, and Nedi Okorafor. The growth of interest in these authors and artists who center the struggle for black futurity and the increasingly wide body of work that has emerged in dialogue with speculative texts cannot be separated from material demands that emerged during this time period. Fund black futures. Abolition, feminism, now. While local organizing continues to transform the discursive environment, furthering and legitimizing abolitionist-oriented discourse on prisons and policing, cultural and artistic projects also help to denaturalize the carceral state and to frame this institutionalized violence as an essential topic for mainstream discussions. Consider, for example, Papa Machete's multimedia puppetry performance that creates a speculative narrative about the last prison in the United States. Visual culture, music, art, and fiction shape the popular imagination in profound ways, outpacing changes in policy and law. Yet all these resources acknowledge, even as we create multiple interventions and responses to supplant carceral approaches, some formally named transformative justice and some not, harm will occur. Women will be sexually assaulted. Trans people will be beaten. Disabled people will be held hostage in their households. And black and other people of color would hurt each other. Our work is not to pretend that these forms of violence will not happen. Our own contexts, projects, worksites, and organizings are not immune. As we write, allegations of sexual harm, transphobia, and racism unfold in organizations and movements around us. We struggle, and we recognize that the highest costs are often experienced by the most vulnerable, people living and organizing without pay from within prisons and other carceral sites, and those working without pay in movements and grassroots organizations. With humility, we acknowledge these risks, and yet we dive in together. This is not impossible work because we do it together. Abolition, Feminism Now outlines how and why abolition is unimaginable without feminism, how feminism is unimaginable without abolition, and why this dialogue is imperative right now. We hope that readers will reflect on these ideas and let themselves be open and move to action. Action not prescribed by us, but inspired by the work, ideas, and challenges archived in this book. Okay, and that is the first half of the introduction. And I'm going to stop there for today. Any questions? If there are no questions, I'm going to say good night to Twitch and YouTube. I shall see you on Tuesday. See you Tuesday. Remember to eat something, drink water, take your meds, and be kind to yourselves. And have a good weekend. I'm going to stay on TikTok for a little while. And then get onto Discord. You can go to all my pay links if you want to tip and show some appreciation for these readings that I do for free. I have my daily tip goal up on the Tiki-Talkie. You can go to my link tree. And you can, if you want to join the Discord,